I knew something was wrong the moment I saw my name written in black marker on a piece of tape stuck to a trash can at my son's wedding. It wasn't even hidden. It sat right there beside the reception table, between a floral centerpiece and a chair that should have been mine. Margaret Whitmore. It read, slightly crooked, like someone had done it in a hurry but still wanted me to see it. I paused for a second, just long enough for the music and laughter around me to feel distant, like I was standing outside of the room instead of inside it. Then I smiled, because after 68 years, you learn that sometimes smiling is the only way to keep your dignity from slipping in front of people who are waiting to see you fall. I adjusted the sleeve of my navy dress, the one I had picked out months ago thinking it would be a proud day, and I walked over, as if nothing was unusual. I set my purse down carefully on the chair next to the trash can, then lowered myself into the seat they had so thoughtfully saved for me. Across the room, I could hear the faint clink of champagne glasses and the soft hum of conversation, but closer to me, there were a few stifled laughs that weren't quite quiet enough. I didn't need to look up to know where they were coming from. Chloe's voice carried easily, light and bright, the kind of voice people trust without question. "Oh, come on," she said, just loud enough for the table to hear. "It's just a joke. Don't be so dramatic." A few people chuckled, relieved, as if that explanation made everything harmless. As if a joke couldn't be a message. I nodded slightly, still smiling, as though I agreed with her, as though I had always been the kind of woman who could laugh at herself. But my hands rested still in my lap, fingers folded neatly, because I knew if I moved them too much, they might reveal what I was really feeling. I glanced at the table in front of me, at the polished silverware and the folded place cards, each one printed elegantly, each one belonging to someone who mattered enough to be seated properly. I had paid for half of this wedding. The venue alone had cost more than my first house back in 1978. The roses lining the aisle, flown in from California, were my contribution. Even the lace on Chloe's dress, hand-stitched, custom-ordered, had been something I insisted on covering, because I believe that when your son finds someone he loves, you welcome her fully. You make space for her. You don't compete. You certainly don't expect to be replaced. But sitting there beside that trash can, I realized something I should have seen much earlier. Chloe never needed to push me out loudly. She did it quietly, in the background. One decision at a time. One missing invitation. One photo where I was asked to stand just a little further back. I had told myself it was nothing. That I was imagining things. That I needed to be more understanding. More modern. More flexible. And yet, here I was, at the one event that was supposed to bring family together, staring at the place she had assigned me. Not at the table. Not even near it. But beside something meant to hold what people throw away. I let out a slow breath, steady and controlled, and reached down to smooth the fabric of my dress, as if that small gesture could press everything back into place. Inside my handbag, resting beneath my gloves and a neatly folded handkerchief, was an envelope I had almost left at home. For a moment, my fingers brushed against it, feeling the weight of what was inside, and I realized that perhaps this day wasn't going to unfold the way Chloe had planned. Not anymore. I kept my eyes on the table in front of me, tracing the edge of the white linen with a slow, deliberate motion, as if I were simply waiting for the next course to be served, as if nothing about my place in that room had been questioned. The music swelled gently in the background, a soft piano arrangement that should have felt warm, but instead it only made the silence around me feel sharper. I could sense people noticing without fully looking, the way guests do when they are unsure whether they are witnessing something inappropriate or simply imagining it. A woman 2 seats down shifted in her chair and leaned toward her husband, whispering something behind her hand. He gave a quick glance in my direction, then looked away just as quickly, choosing comfort over curiosity. I did not blame them. Most people prefer the version of events that asks nothing of them. I reached for my glass of water, lifting it with steady fingers, taking a small sip even though my throat felt tight. Across the room, Daniel stood near the bar, laughing with one of his college friends, his posture relaxed, his hand resting casually in his pocket. For a moment, I watched him the way I used to when he was a boy playing in the backyard, making sure he was safe, making sure he was happy. He had always been easy to read back then. If he was upset, I knew. If he was hiding something, it showed. But now, as I studied his face from a distance of maybe 30 feet, I realized I could not tell if he had seen what was done to me, or if he had chosen not to see it at all. Chloe moved beside him a moment later, her hand sliding lightly onto his arm, guiding him as she spoke. He nodded, smiling, following her lead without hesitation. That, more than anything, settled something inside me. This was not a moment. It was a pattern. I set the glass back down exactly where it had been, aligning it with the fork beside my plate, maintaining the small order that still belonged to me. A server passed by, hesitating briefly as she noticed where I was seated, her eyes flicking between the table number and the trash can before offering me a polite, uncertain smile. "Can I get you anything, ma'am?" she asked softly. I returned the smile, just as polite, just as contained. "No, thank you," I said, my voice even, as though I were exactly where I was meant to be. She nodded and moved on, but not before adjusting one of the centerpieces on the table, a subtle attempt to restore a balance that had already been broken. I let my gaze drift again, this time taking in the details I had once been proud of. The string lights I had insisted on adding to the ceiling cast a gentle glow over the room. The custom menus, printed on thick cream paper, lay neatly at each place setting. Every element had been chosen with care, with the intention of creating something beautiful for my son. And yet, beauty has a way of revealing contrast. The more perfect everything else looked, the more deliberate my placement felt. I rested my hand lightly on my handbag, feeling the outline of the envelope again, its edges firm beneath the leather. I had brought it out of caution, a quiet instinct I could not fully explain at the time. Now it felt less like caution and more like preparation. I did not rush. I did not react. I simply sat there, breathing evenly, letting the room continue as if nothing had shifted, even though I knew something had. Not out there, not in the music or the laughter or the speeches that would come later. But here, inside me, where the last of my doubt had finally settled into something clear and unmovable. I was no longer confused about my place in their world. And more importantly, I was no longer willing to accept it. I remained seated as the room slowly shifted into the next phase of the evening, the soft music fading into a more upbeat tune as guests began to rise, glasses in hand, moving toward the dance floor or clustering into small groups. Chairs scraped lightly against the floor, conversations grew louder, and the earlier moments seemed to dissolve into the background, at least for everyone else. For me, it settled deeper, becoming quieter but more defined, like something placed carefully into its final position. I watched as a few relatives approached my table, their smiles polite, their eyes uncertain, each one deciding in real time how to behave. "Margaret, everything looks beautiful," one of Daniel's cousins said, her voice overly bright, as if she were compensating for something unspoken. I nodded and thanked her, keeping my tone warm, giving her exactly what she needed to move on without discomfort. Another guest gave a quick laugh and gestured lightly toward the trash can beside me, as though acknowledging it would somehow make it harmless. "Well, I guess you have the most unique seat in the house," he said, trailing off before the sentence could fully land. I offered a small smile, the kind that ends conversations rather than continues them, and he quickly excused himself, relief evident in the way he stepped away. I did not hold it against them. It is not easy to stand still in the presence of quiet disrespect. Most people prefer to step around it, pretend it is not there, or accept the explanation that has already been offered. "It is just a joke. Do not be so dramatic." Those words lingered, not because they hurt, but because they clarified something. A joke invites laughter from everyone. This invited silence from most and discomfort from the rest. That is not humor. That is intention. I glanced again toward Daniel, who was now speaking with the wedding coordinator, his expression focused, nodding as she pointed toward the stage area where the microphone stood ready. The speeches would begin soon. I had known that from the schedule we finalized weeks ago, the same schedule I had reviewed twice, making sure everything flowed properly, making sure his day would be seamless. My day, it seemed, had been assigned a different purpose. I placed both hands gently on the table and pushed myself up from the chair, smoothing my dress once more, not in haste, but with care, as though each movement mattered. No one stopped me. No one questioned where I was going. Why would they? I had been invisible for most of the evening already. I picked up my handbag, holding it close, the weight of the envelope inside now unmistakable, not heavy in the physical sense, but significant in a way that steadied me. I moved slowly along the edge of the room, passing behind tables where laughter continued, where glasses clinked, where conversations carried on untouched. A few eyes followed me briefly, then returned to their own circles. The closer I came to the front, the clearer everything became. The stage lights cast a soft glow over the microphone stand, illuminating a small space that felt separate from the rest of the room, a place where words would soon be given structure and attention. I stopped just short of it, waiting, not out of hesitation, but because timing matters. The wedding coordinator stepped forward, adjusting the microphone, tapping it lightly before announcing that it was time for a few words from family. Applause followed, warm and expected. Names were mentioned, laughter accompanied familiar anecdotes, and one by one, people approached, spoke, and stepped away. I listened without interruption, without reaction, my expression composed, my posture steady. And when there was a brief pause, a small opening between speakers, I took a step forward, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the kind of quiet certainty that does not ask for permission. My hand reached the microphone, and for the first time that evening, I allowed the room to truly see me. I did not clear my throat or tap the microphone the way the others had done. I simply adjusted it slightly to match my height and let my hands rest on either side of the stand, steady and unhurried. And for a brief moment I said nothing at all, allowing the room to settle into the quiet that naturally follows expectation rather than forcing it into silence. And when I finally spoke, my voice came out even, calm, and measured, the same voice I had used to read bedtime stories and to give advice. No one asked for any more. "Good evening," I said, offering a small, polite smile as I let my gaze move across the room, not searching for approval, just acknowledging presence. For those of you who may not know me, I am Margaret Whitmore, Daniel's mother. There was a soft ripple of recognition, a few nods, a few murmured confirmations, and I continued without pause. I have had the privilege of watching my son grow from a curious little boy who once asked me why the sky changes color at sunset, into the man standing here today. I glanced briefly in his direction, not long enough to hold him there, just enough to mark the connection. And like any mother, I have spent many years hoping that one day he would find someone who would stand beside him with kindness, with patience, and with respect. I let that word rest for a second, not emphasized, just placed carefully. And tonight, we are all here to celebrate that moment. A few guests smiled, some lifted their glasses slightly, expecting the familiar rhythm of a sentimental speech, the kind that wraps everything in warmth and leaves no room for discomfort. And for a second, I allowed that expectation to exist, because it made what came next clearer without needing to raise my voice. I have always believed that family is not defined by proximity or by titles, but by the way we choose to treat one another when it matters most. I continued, my tone unchanged, my posture relaxed. Not in private, where things can be explained away or forgotten, but in public, where our actions speak without interruption. The room grew quieter, not abruptly, but gradually, as if each person was becoming aware of something they could not yet name. Moments like this one, gatherings like tonight, they have a way of revealing more than we intend, I said, folding my hands lightly in front of me now. They show us where we stand, not just in the room, but in each other's lives. I could feel the attention sharpening, not in a dramatic shift, but in the subtle stillness that replaces casual listening, and I reached into my handbag slowly, not as a gesture of surprise, but as a continuation of the same calm rhythm I had maintained all evening, my fingers closing around the envelope before bringing it into view, holding it gently against the side of the microphone stand. I brought something with me tonight, I said, glancing down at it briefly before looking back up. Not because I expected to use it, but because I have learned that it is better to be prepared for clarity than to remain comfortable in confusion. There was no laughter now. No shifting of chairs, just a quiet attention that settled across the room. You see, sometimes what appears to be a small detail, I continued, my voice still soft, a misplaced name, an overlooked seat, a simple joke, can carry a meaning that extends far beyond the moment itself. I paused, not for effect, but because the sentence had reached its natural end, and I allowed the silence to hold it there. And when that meaning becomes clear, it gives us an opportunity, I said, lifting the envelope slightly, an opportunity to decide whether we accept it or whether we choose to respond. I did not open it yet. I did not rush the moment. I simply held it there, steady in my hand, as the weight of what had not yet been said began to settle over the room. I let the envelope rest lightly in my hand for another second, long enough for the room to fully settle into the quiet that had replaced the earlier laughter, and then I opened it with a calm, deliberate motion, sliding out a few neatly folded documents without rushing, without hesitation, as if this had always been part of the evening's plan. A few weeks ago, I began, my voice steady and clear. I was asked to review some financial arrangements connected to this wedding. I glanced briefly toward Daniel, not accusing, not searching, simply acknowledging his presence in the truth that was about to unfold. Nothing unusual at first, just final invoices, confirmations, the kind of details that come with planning something of this size. I lifted one page slightly, enough for the gesture to register, but not enough to turn it into a display. But as I looked more closely, I noticed something that did not quite align. I continued, letting the words land. Gently, without force. Certain payments had been redirected, certain accounts had been adjusted, and certain decisions had been made without my knowledge, despite the fact that my name was still attached to them. There was a subtle shift in the room now, a tightening of attention, the kind that comes when people realize they are no longer listening to a simple toast. I did not react immediately. I said, my tone unchanged. I took my time, I asked questions, and I verified what I was seeing. Because clarity deserves patience, I lowered the page slightly and looked out across the guests again. And what I found was not a mistake. I added quietly. It was a pattern. I let that word sit for a moment before continuing. Funds that were intended for shared expenses were being moved into a separate account, one that I did not authorize, one that I was not even informed existed. A faint murmur moved through the room, quickly subdued, as people leaned slightly closer, not wanting to miss what came next. Now, I understand that weddings are complicated, that decisions are made quickly, and that sometimes communication falls short, I said, offering the same calm reasoning that had guided me through most of my life. But transparency is not optional when trust is involved. I shifted the documents in my hand, aligning them carefully, maintaining that same sense of order. So I requested copies of everything. I continued. Every transfer, every signature, every authorization. My eyes moved briefly toward Chloe now, not with anger, but with a quiet recognition. And I received them, I said simply. In full. The room felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had drawn in just enough to hold the weight of what was being revealed. What matters is not the amount, I added, gently. It is the intention behind it. I paused, letting that distinction settle, because intention tells us whether something was done with respect or without it. I folded the papers once more, not hiding them, just returning them to their place. I did not come here tonight to create a scene, I said, my voice still even, still controlled. I came here to celebrate my son. I allowed a small breath to pass before continuing. But when a moment reveals the truth so clearly, it would be a disservice to ignore it. I lifted my gaze again, meeting the room without flinching, without apology, so I made a decision, I said, my hand resting once more against the envelope. A simple one. I did not rush the words that followed. I allowed them to arrive at their own pace. I have already taken the necessary steps to remove my name from any and all financial responsibilities connected to this event and any future arrangements. A quiet ripple moved through the guests, subtle but undeniable. Effective immediately, I added, calmly. Every remaining balance, every outstanding cost, and every financial obligation has been reassigned to the individuals who made those decisions without me. I did not raise my voice, I did not need to. And as for everything that was redirected, I continued. It has been formally documented and reported through the appropriate channels to ensure that it is returned to its original purpose. I let the final words settle into the silence that followed, not sharp, not loud, just clear, as I lowered the envelope slightly, my posture unchanged, my expression steady, as if I had simply finished explaining something that should have been understood from the beginning. I did not step away from the microphone right away after I finished speaking. I simply let my hand rest lightly against the stand, giving the room enough time to fully absorb what had just been said without rushing to fill the silence that followed, because silence, when it is earned, has a way of carrying more weight than anything added to it. And for a few seconds no one moved, no one spoke. Not even the faint clink of glasses or the shuffle of chairs. It was as if the entire room had paused. Mid-breath, trying to decide how to respond to something that had not been loud but had been unmistakably clear, I glanced briefly toward Daniel again, and this time he was looking directly at me. His expression no longer relaxed, no longer distant. There was a tension in his posture now, a slight stiffness in the way his shoulders held, as though he had just stepped into a moment he did not fully understand but could no longer ignore. Chloe stood beside him, her hand no longer resting comfortably on his arm. Her fingers had withdrawn, her posture more rigid, her smile gone, replaced by something tighter, something controlled. And for the first time that evening, she did not look like someone guiding the room. She looked like someone recalculating it. I did not hold their gaze for long. I did not need to. I had already said what needed to be said, and anything more would have been repetition rather than purpose. So I gave a small nod, the same polite acknowledgement I had offered at the beginning, and stepped back from the microphone with the same calm precision I had carried throughout the night. No sudden movements, no dramatic gestures, just a quiet return to stillness. As I turned slightly, I noticed the wedding coordinator standing off to the side. Her clipboard held a little tighter than before, her expression uncertain, as if she were waiting for someone to tell her whether to continue or to pause. But no one stepped forward, no one gave direction. The structure of the evening, so carefully planned, had shifted in a way that could not be easily corrected. I walked past the front tables, my pace steady, my posture unchanged, and as I moved, I could feel the attention following me now, not the distant curiosity from earlier, but something more focused, more aware. Conversations that had once flowed freely were now quieter, voices lowered, words chosen more carefully. I passed by the table where I had been seated, the trash can still in place, the piece of tape with my name still visible, unchanged, but it no longer held the same meaning it had before. Because meaning depends on acceptance, and I had already withdrawn mine. I reached down and picked up my handbag from the chair beside it, holding it close once again, not as protection, but as completion. And for a brief moment, I allowed my hand to rest against the back of the chair, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingers, grounding myself in something simple, something real, before letting go. Across the room, a few guests began to move again, slowly, cautiously, as if testing whether it was acceptable to resume what had been interrupted. A glass was lifted, a quiet sentence exchanged, but the atmosphere had changed, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough that it could not return to what it had been. I made my way toward the exit, not hurried, not delayed, simply following the path that had opened the moment I chose not to remain where I had been placed. And as I reached the doors, I paused for a second, not to look back at anyone in particular, but to take in the room as a whole, the lights, the tables, the carefully arranged details that had once represented something meaningful to me. And I realized that nothing in that room had actually changed except my understanding of it. And that understanding, once clear, does not fade. It settles, quietly and completely, and with that, I stepped forward, leaving behind the sound of a celebration that no longer required my presence. The air outside felt cooler than I expected, a quiet contrast to the warmth and noise I had just stepped away from. And for a moment, I simply stood there beneath the soft glow of the venue lights, letting the stillness settle around me the way the silence inside the room had settled earlier. Only this time it did not carry tension, it carried clarity. I adjusted the strap of my handbag on my shoulder and walked slowly toward the edge of the parking area, my heels making a steady sound against the pavement, each step measured, not because I was uncertain, but because there was no longer any need to rush. Behind me, the music began again, faint at first, then slightly louder as the doors opened briefly to let someone else pass through, followed by a low murmur of voices that did not quite return to the lightness they had before. I did not turn around. I did not need to see it to understand it. Some things you can feel without looking, and that was enough. I reached my car and paused. Again, not out of hesitation, but out of habit. The same small pause I had taken countless times before unlocking the door after a long day. Only this time it felt different, as if I were standing between two versions of my life. One that had quietly accepted what was given, and one that had finally chosen to define its own place. I opened the door and set my handbag carefully on the passenger seat, the envelope still inside, no longer hidden, no longer uncertain, just a part of the decision I had already made. I sat down and closed the door gently, shutting out the distant sounds of the reception, leaving only the quiet hum of the evening and my own steady breathing. For a moment, I rested my hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine, allowing myself to feel the absence of everything that had once filled my days, the planning, the expectations, the belief that effort and love would naturally be returned in kind. I had carried that belief for decades, through birthdays, holidays, and every small moment in between, and I realized now that it had not disappeared. It had simply been misplaced in the wrong hands. I turned the key and the engine came to life with a soft vibration, grounding me in the present, and as the headlights illuminated the path ahead, I thought about Daniel, about the boy he had been, and the man he was becoming, and I understood that there are moments in life when people are given a chance to see clearly, to recognize what has been done, and to choose differently. Whether they take that chance is something no one else can control. I shifted the car into drive and began to move forward slowly, the venue growing smaller in the rearview mirror, its lights fading into the background, not dramatically, just steadily, like something that had served its purpose and no longer needed to remain in focus. I did not feel anger. I did not feel regret. I felt something quieter, something more complete, the kind of understanding that does not ask for resolution because it already knows where it stands. And as I drove away, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I was not leaving something behind. I was simply moving forward, without carrying what was never mine to hold in the first place. The road ahead stretched out in a quiet line, illuminated only by the steady reach of my headlights. And for the first few miles I drove without turning on the radio, without filling the silence, letting my thoughts settle into something clearer than they had been in years, not heavier, just more precise, like pieces finally placed where they belonged. I passed familiar streets, places I had driven by countless times, a grocery store on the corner where I used to pick up Daniel's favorite cereal when he was young, the small park where he once insisted on staying until the sun went down even when I told him it was getting late. And I realized how easily memory can hold on to the best parts while quietly ignoring everything that does not fit. I slowed at a red light and rested my hands gently on the steering wheel, watching the empty intersection ahead, and for a moment I allowed myself to acknowledge something I had avoided for a long time. Not about Chloe, not about the wedding, but about the choices I had made long before any of this happened. I had mistaken patience for acceptance, generosity for obligation, and silence for peace, and over time those small misunderstandings had shaped the way I was treated, not because people are always cruel, but because they learn what we allow without ever saying it out loud. The light turned green, and I continued forward, the motion steady, uninterrupted, and as I drove I thought about the envelope again, about the documents inside, about the care I had taken to verify every detail before deciding what to do. It had not been a reaction. It had been a conclusion, something built slowly over time until there was no other reasonable direction left. My phone remained silent on the seat beside me. No calls, no messages, just the quiet confirmation that whatever was happening behind me was no longer something I needed to manage or explain. I turned onto the street leading to my home. The familiar houses lined neatly on either side, each one lit softly from within, and when I pulled into my driveway, I sat for a moment before turning off the engine, the sudden stillness settling around me like a gentle pause rather than an empty space. I gathered my handbag and stepped out, closing the car door with the same quiet care I had carried through the entire evening. Inside, the house felt exactly as I had left it, calm, ordered, untouched by the events of the night. I placed my keys in their usual spot, set my handbag on the table, and removed the envelope, holding it briefly before placing it down as well. Not hidden, not emphasized, just present. I walked into the living room and turned on a single lamp, the soft light filling the space without overwhelming it, and I sat down slowly, not out of exhaustion, but out of intention, allowing myself to fully arrive in a place that belonged entirely to me. No expectations, no adjustments, no quiet negotiations of where I fit. I looked around at the room, at the photographs on the shelves, at the life I had built piece by piece over the years, and I realized that nothing essential had been taken from me. Not really. What had changed was my understanding of where to place my effort, where to offer my presence, and where to step back without hesitation. I rested my hands in my lap, feeling the steady rhythm of my breathing, and for the first time that evening, I allowed myself a small, unforced smile, not because anything had been resolved, but because something had been clarified, and clarity, once reached, does not ask for permission to remain. It simply stays, quiet and unwavering, shaping everything that comes after. The house remained quiet as the evening settled deeper into the night, the soft glow of the lamp casting long, gentle shadows across the room, and I stayed where I was for a while, not out of fatigue, but because there was no longer any urgency pulling me in different directions, no expectations waiting to be met, no roles to quietly maintain, just a stillness that felt earned rather than empty. I reached for the envelope again, not because I needed to read it, but because it represented something final, something that had already been decided with clarity and intention. I opened it once more and looked at the documents inside, the signatures, the confirmations, the careful steps taken to ensure that what had been misused would be corrected, not out of revenge, but out of principle, because respect, once compromised, does not restore itself without action. I placed the papers back inside and set the envelope down on the table beside me. No longer a question, no longer a contingency, just a completed chapter. My phone lit up briefly with a notification, a single message appearing on the screen. I glanced at it without reaching for it immediately, allowing myself a moment before deciding whether to engage with whatever waited on the other side. When I finally picked it up, I saw Daniel's name. A short message, simple, without explanation, asking if we could talk. I read it once, then again, not searching for meaning beyond what was written, just acknowledging it for what it was, a moment presented, a choice offered. I set the phone back down without responding right away, not out of indifference, but because I understood something now that I had not fully understood before, that not every moment requires an immediate answer. Some require space, some require time, and some require the other person to meet you where you are without being guided there. I leaned back slightly in my chair and let my gaze move across the room again, at the photographs, at the quiet details that had always been mine, and I realized that the evening had not taken anything from me that truly belonged to me. It had only revealed what never did. I stood up slowly and walked toward the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to look out at the dark street beyond. The same street I had driven down countless times, now still and undisturbed. And in that reflection, faint against the glass, I saw myself not as someone diminished by what had happened, but as someone who had finally stepped out of a place that no longer deserved her presence. I let the curtain fall back into place and returned to the table, picking up my phone once more, my thumb hovering over the screen for a brief second before I typed a short reply. Not long, not emotional, just clear, telling him that we could talk, but not tonight. I set the phone down again and turned off the lamp, allowing the room to settle into darkness, not heavy, not uncertain, just quiet, the kind of quiet that does not ask for anything more. And as I made my way toward the hallway, I understood that whatever came next would not be shaped by what had been done to me, but by what I chose to accept moving forward, and that choice, once made with clarity, does not need to be explained. It simply becomes the standard by which everything else is measured.